Hey guys, tonight we journey back to a time when the world was colder, darker, and far less cozy than your favorite blanket fort. You trudge through snow-dusted pine forests, the bitter wind biting at your cheeks, and the sky stretched in endless shades of gray. Imagine living in a land where the sun barely rises for half the year, where survival demands cunning, grit, and a good solid axe. Now, take that tough, relentless spirit and add a burning hunger to conquer the unknown, and that's where your story begins. You probably won't survive this night in the frozen north, but hey, the Vikings did, and then some. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm curious if you're snugging under a blanket, fan humming softly nearby, or battling a midnight heat wave as we dive in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You start in Scandinavia, that triangle of jagged fjords and sprawling forests hugging the Arctic Circle, the birthplace of the Vikings. Picture Norway's sheer cliffs plunging into icy waters, Sweden's endless pine forests, and Denmark's wind-swept plains. It's a place where winters are brutal, summers fleeting, and life demands toughness. The Vikings, or Norsemen, were born from this unforgiving landscape, shaped by hardship and a close relationship with nature's raw power. You might imagine that a cold, inhospitable land would breed cautious folk. But nope, these people were bold. Their world was harsh, yes, but it was also a forge where warriors were hammered out. The scarcity of resources and the unpredictability of weather pushed them toward exploration, raiding, and expanding beyond their homelands. Historians still argue whether the Viking spirit of adventure stemmed more from necessity or sheer bloodlust. Was it the need to find fertile land and wealth, or did their culture glorify conquest for its own sake? Maybe a bit of both. They didn't just survive, they thrived by mastering the balance between brutality and adaptability. Interestingly, while we often picture Vikings as wild berserkers howling in battle, their origins were far more nuanced. Early Norse communities had complex social structures with chieftains, skilled craftsmen, and farmers who knew the value of cooperation. But make no mistake, these were hardy people. The cold wasn't just a backdrop, it was an adversary they respected and feared. Here's a quirky tidbit. Vikings likely used a kind of sun compass, made of crystal stones that polarized light, to navigate even under cloudy skies. Imagine that, a natural GPS long before satellites. Science suggests this sunstones legend might be more than myth, a testament to their ingenuity. You wander through tales of ice and fire, of long winters huddled around smoky hearths, listening to skalds recite epic poems about gods and heroes. These stories were more than entertainment. They forged a collective identity rooted in resilience and honor. Their gods, like Odin and Thor, embodied the values they aspired to: courage, wisdom, and strength. The landscape forced them to look outward. When the ground was too hard to farm, or the village too crowded, they built ships that could slice through the rough seas. These ships weren't just transport, they were lifelines to new opportunities. It's easy to forget that the Vikings weren't just raiders. They were traders, explorers, and settlers. Remember that brutal cold, the endless night? It wasn't just a challenge, but a catalyst, pushing them toward the sea, to adventure, and eventually, to become Europe's nightmare. You're already on the edge of the fjord, the salty mist brushing your face, watching a longship glide smoothly over the dark waves like a shadow come to life. It's sleek, narrow, and almost unnervingly silent, despite the power driving it forward. Your first glimpse of the Vikings' secret weapon. These ships were more than just wood and nails. They were lightning strikes on water, crafted for speed and surprise. Longships had shallow drafts, allowing them to slip close to beaches or sneak up rivers, places no heavy warship could follow. You imagine the rowers' rhythmic strokes, muscles taut and sweat mixing with sea spray, propelling the vessel fast enough to evade alarm, but quiet enough to catch victims unprepared. These ships weren't just for war, they carried traders, settlers, and explorers on journeys that would stretch from the icy North Atlantic to the Mediterranean and beyond. Lightning raids, as historians call them, were brutal and efficient. You've heard of them: a sudden attack at dawn, a village or monastery utterly unprepared, shocked into chaos. There was no prolonged siege or drawn-out battle. The Vikings struck fast, grabbed what they wanted, and vanished before any organized defense could form. You could almost hear the terrified screams mingling with the crash of oars as the ships raced away. You probably think the Vikings just barreled in with axes swinging, but there was real tactical genius here. They chose targets carefully, focusing on places rich in wealth but poor in defenses. Religious sites were prime targets, not just for their riches, but for the psychological blow against Christian Europe. The shock of monks being slaughtered and sacred halls looted sent waves of panic far beyond the immediate area. Historians still argue whether these raids were primarily about survival, wealth, or a combination of both. Some say the raids were a response to overpopulation and poor farmland back home. Others see them as expressions of a culture that glorified battle and adventure. Maybe both are true, but the impact was undeniable. Europe's coastal communities lived in fear, scrambling to fortify their shores. Here's a quirky detail. Vikings could reverse their ships quickly and silently, thanks to the symmetrical shape of their longships. This allowed a fast getaway even in tight spots, like narrow rivers or shallow estuaries. It's like having a sports car that can do a three-point turn in the blink of an eye. Definitely a nightmare for those trying to catch them. Their lightning raids had a psychological effect almost as devastating as the physical damage. Coastal villages would hear tales of the dreaded dragon ships coming out of the mist, and even rumors could empty towns as people fled inland or barricaded themselves. Imagine living with that fear, never knowing when the next raid might sweep away your home and loved ones. The longship wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a symbol of freedom and power. Unlike heavier, cumbersome vessels of the time, these ships could be beached and relaunched quickly, allowing Vikings to strike anywhere from the Orkneys to the coasts of France and Spain. Their mobility was unmatched, and that made the Vikings unpredictable. Also fascinating. Vikings didn't always row. They used square sails that could catch the wind for swift travel, but when stealth was essential, oars were king. This hybrid propulsion gave them flexibility, adapting to weather and mission with ease. Your imagination drifts to the scenes on those ships. Warriors armed with spears, shields, and axes, faces painted or tattooed, chanting battle hymns as the coastline loomed. The smell of salt, sweat, and leather filled the air, mixing with a tense excitement. Raiding wasn't just about plunder. It was a rite of passage, a test of courage and honor. Remember that sun compass from the last section? Navigating the foggy coasts and dark rivers demanded more than just luck. Vikings used stars, landmarks, and perhaps even those sunstones to keep their course true, enabling them to launch raids hundreds of miles from home with terrifying precision. And despite their fierce reputation, Vikings also adapted quickly. If a raid went wrong, they could retreat before losses mounted, preserving their fighting force for the next strike. Their commanders understood the value of hit-and-run tactics better than many of their contemporaries stuck in slow, traditional warfare. So you see, the Vikings' mastery of the seas, through their longships and lightning raids, made them a ghostly nightmare for many Europeans. They were fast, clever, and ruthless, striking fear into hearts long before battle cries filled the air. You lean back, feeling the chill of the northern wind brushing your skin as you imagine the flickering flames of a fire illuminating a gathering of Norsemen and women beneath the starry Scandinavian sky. Their world is not only shaped by frost and sea, but by gods who walk the thin line between chaos and order, gods who demand fierce loyalty and courage. The Vikings' fierce beliefs in gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya aren't just mythological fluff. They are the heartbeat driving their restless spirit and fearless raids. Odin, the one-eyed god of wisdom and war, isn't your typical benevolent deity. He's a figure who sacrifices an eye for knowledge, who seeks out the bravest souls to join him in Valhalla after death, where warriors fight and feast until the final battle at Ragnarok. You get the sense that for Vikings, dying in battle wasn't tragic. It was glorious, the ultimate ticket to eternal honor. It's a stark contrast to the more passive Christian afterlife concept that the European villagers clung to, and maybe that explains a bit of their unshakable ferocity. Historians still argue whether Viking raids were motivated more by religious zeal, economic necessity, or a combination of both. Some suggest the Norse saw raiding as a sacred duty, almost a pilgrimage toward glory in the eyes of their gods. Others argue the raids were pragmatic ventures driven by politics and wealth. Probably it was a mix. Ancient Norse spirituality provided both meaning and fire to their exploits. The Vikings' spiritual world was woven tightly with runes, mystical symbols carved into stones, weapons, and wood. Runes weren't just letters. They were believed to carry magical power. You imagine a Viking warrior whispering runes over his axe or shield before battle, hoping to sway fate in his favor. It's a practice that hints at a mystical side beneath the rugged exterior. Here's a quirky detail. There's evidence that Vikings used cedar, a form of Norse magic or shamanism, often practiced by women called vulvas, who could supposedly see the future or influence outcomes. This mystical tradition adds a layer of complexity. Viking spirituality wasn't just about brute force, but included subtle magical beliefs that influenced their decisions and worldview. Viking gods also reflected their environment. Thor, the thunder god, wielded his mighty hammer to protect humans from giants, embodying the power of storms that so often roared through their homeland. Freya, goddess of love and fertility, showed that life and death danced closely in the Viking mind, where passion and battle were intertwined. You picture ritual feasts, where warriors and chieftains gathered to honor the gods, drinking mead from ornate horns, telling stories of heroes past and those who die bravely soon. These gatherings reinforced a communal identity bound by faith and the warrior ethos. The Vikings' spiritual beliefs also helped explain the harsh realities of their environment and fate. When winter cut crops short or a raid failed, gods might be displeased, or fate had other plans. This fatalism, mixed with fierce courage, pushed Vikings to seize whatever chance they had, knowing life was fleeting. One more thing. Those famous Viking helmets with horns? Total myth. Archaeologists have found no evidence of horned helmets used in battle. That image probably comes from 19th century romanticized operas. Real Viking helmets were practical, designed for protection without unnecessary flair. Remember those runes and sunstones from earlier? The Vikings' blend of practical skills and spiritual belief made them uniquely equipped to face their challenging world. Their gods inspired courage, their runes offered protection, and their ships carried them to fortune or doom. So, the Vikings' religion and beliefs weren't just background noise. They were an essential fuel for the storm of raids and conquests that would haunt Europe for centuries. The gods whispered promises of glory, the runes sparked courage, and you, standing there, can almost hear the distant thunder of Thor's hammer as it heralds the next raid. You feel the weight of a heavy shield pressing against your forearm, the rough leather strap biting into your skin as your heartbeat quickens with every clash of swords around you. The Viking warrior code pulses through your veins, an unspoken oath written in blood and honor. This code isn't etched in stone or scrolls. It's carved into the very fabric of their culture, a set of brutal yet captivating rules that shaped how they fought, lived, and died. For Vikings, honor was everything. You don't just survive, you prove yourself worthy through deeds. Loyalty to your lord, family, and comrades was non-negotiable. Backstabbing, shameful, cowardice, worse than death. The ideal warrior embraced battle frenzy, or berserker gang, a wild trance-like fury said to turn fighters into unstoppable forces, tearing through enemies with little regard for pain or safety. Historians still argue whether berserkers were real warriors entering battle trances or a later exaggeration by medieval writers romanticizing Viking savagery. Some even suggest it was a form of controlled madness or drug-induced state, while others view it as symbolic storytelling. Either way, the legend reflects how Vikings themselves valued fearlessness and ferocity. Your weapon of choice, be it a sword, axe, or spear, is almost an extension of your soul. Swords were treasured heirlooms, often passed down through generations, adorned with runic inscriptions and intricate designs. Axes, simpler but deadly, were the great equalizer, wielded by farmers and nobles alike. Spears offered reach and precision, favored by skilled tacticians. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Vikings carried sagas knives, short blades that doubled as tools for daily life and weapons for sudden fights. This practicality showed their readiness for battle at any moment, reflecting a culture where the line between survival and combat was razor thin. Your reputation wasn't just built on bravery, but also on your ability to balance ferocity with cunning. Vikings often used tactics like feigned retreats or surprise night attacks, blending brute strength with strategic planning. They respected strength, but they also respected brains. Loyalty tied closely to kinship and personal bonds. You'd follow your chieftain to death, not just for gold, but because your honor demanded it. Betrayal meant exile, loss of reputation, or worse, death. In this way, Viking warriors formed tight-knit bands whose unity could turn the tide of battle. The concept of holmgang was a formal duel to settle disputes or defend honor. This wasn't chaotic brawling, but a structured fight with agreed rules. Losing a holmgang could mean death or exile, making it a serious gamble, but a crucial social mechanism to maintain order. One of the most compelling aspects of the Viking warrior code was their acceptance of fate, or word. They believed that destiny was set, but it was their duty to meet it boldly. You might lose your life, but dying honorably in battle guaranteed a place in Valhalla, where feasts never end, and warriors prepare for the final Ragnarok. Remember the gods from the last section? Their warrior code echoed the values embodied by Odin and Thor. Strength, bravery, and the glory of combat. It wasn't just about violence, but living a life worthy of legend. Vikings also took pride in their physical appearance. Long hair, braided beards, and sometimes tattoos or painted faces. They cared about grooming, which may surprise you considering their fierce reputation. Good hygiene even earned them respect among contemporaries. Despite their warlike image, Vikings valued storytelling, poetry, and music. Skalds recited epic sagas praising heroes and chronicling battles. This oral tradition reinforced the warrior code by immortalizing deeds and encouraging others to follow suit. Of course, the warrior code wasn't flawless. It encouraged risk-taking that sometimes led to unnecessary death or conflict, and it upheld social hierarchies that could be brutal to outsiders. But for Vikings, it was the glue that held their volatile society together, a balance of honor, loyalty, and ferocity that made them formidable foes and legends in their own right. So, as you grip your shield and raise your axe, remember this code. It's not just about the fight, it's about becoming part of a story that echoes across centuries, a story where courage is currency and honor is your legacy. You shift your weight on the rough wooden deck, feeling the heft of your axe at your side and the reassuring thud of your round wooden shield strapped tight to your arm. The clink of chainmail against leather echoes softly, and the chill air carries the scent of pine tar and sea spray. These weapons and armor aren't just tools, they're extensions of your very self, crafted carefully, used with deadly precision, and carried into the chaos of battle without hesitation. Vikings didn't wear horned helmets, sorry to burst your theatrical bubble, but their helmets were practical and effective, usually rounded with a sturdy iron cap and a simple nose guard to protect the face. It was armor designed for survival, not style points. Chainmail shirts were common among wealthier warriors, offering flexibility and protection. Others wore leather or layered garments that provided decent defense without slowing them down. Their primary weapon was often the axe, and not just any axe, but the bearded axe, a design that extended below the handle, allowing hooking or slicing moves that made it versatile in close combat. These axes could cleave shields, helmets, and flesh with terrifying efficiency. Historians still argue whether the classic Viking sword was more a status symbol than a battlefield staple. Swords were expensive and rare, often inherited and cherished. A good sword could be a family heirloom, inscribed with runes and legends. Losing one was a disgrace, almost as bad as losing your life. Spears, meanwhile, were the most common weapon, favored for their reach and versatility, throwing or thrusting, depending on the fight. You might think that Vikings relied purely on brute strength, but their weapons show a surprising level of sophistication and craftsmanship. Blacksmiths were skilled artisans who shaped iron with knowledge passed down through generations, sometimes even infusing weapons with symbolic carvings for protection or luck. A quirky tidbit: some Viking swords had inscriptions that translated to things like thunderstrike or bear's fury, suggesting the warrior believed their blade was almost alive with power. It's like giving your weapon a nickname or a personality, an early form of what we now call psychological warfare. Defensive gear wasn't just helmets and chainmail. Shields were your lifeline, often large, round, and made of layered wood covered with leather. The shield's boss, the metal dome in the center, could be used offensively to bash opponents. Shields were also painted in bright colors and patterns, serving both intimidation and identification in battle. The Vikings' approach to armor was pragmatic. Heavy plate armor hadn't been developed yet, and too much weight could be a liability. Speed, agility, and endurance mattered more than clanking around like a medieval tank. Their fighting style relied on fast, brutal strikes rather than drawn-out engagements. One more fun fact: some Vikings carried small, sharp throwing knives known as daggers, perfect for close quarters or surprise attacks. These weren't glamorous weapons, but deadly when used by skilled hands. Viking warriors also carried hunting and everyday tools, because life wasn't just battle. It was also surviving harsh winters, cooking, and crafting. Their toolkit was practical, but could become deadly when needed. Remember the sunstones and runes from earlier? Vikings believed their weapons and armor held spiritual significance, with runic inscriptions, sometimes carved into blades or shield rims, to invoke protection or favor from the gods. Your grip tightens on your axe handle as you prepare for the next clash. This isn't just about survival. It's about proving your worth, carrying forward a legacy forged in iron and fire. So, the next time you picture Vikings, forget the Hollywood helmets and cliches. Instead, think of a fiercely practical, terrifyingly effective warrior, whose weapons and armor were as much about skill and spirit as about brute force. You step off the longship onto a muddy shoreline, the cold water licking at your boots as the salty breeze carries unfamiliar scents. But this isn't home. This is a new land, vast and wild, waiting to be claimed. The Vikings weren't just raiders who struck and vanished. They were settlers, explorers, and farmers eager to carve out new lives beyond the icy fjords. Their settlements stretched from the British Isles to the windswept shores of Iceland and the rugged coasts of Greenland. The process of colonization wasn't haphazard. Vikings scouted lands carefully, looking for fertile soil, safe harbors, and resources to support communities. You imagine them clearing forests with axes, building longhouses from timber and stone, and planting crops that might survive the shorter growing seasons. They brought livestock too, cattle, sheep, and horses, to establish self-sufficient farms. Historians still argue whether the Viking settlements were temporary outposts for raiding or permanent communities with lasting impact. The evidence leans toward the latter. Many settlements became thriving towns and even early cities, influencing local culture, economy, and genetics. One fascinating tidbit: Vikings settled in Iceland around 870 AD, but the land was volcanic and unpredictable. Despite this, they established a functioning society with laws and assemblies, the Althing, one of the world's oldest parliaments. Imagine setting up democracy in a land where glaciers and geysers reign supreme. In England and Ireland, Vikings not only raided, but also integrated with local populations. You can picture the cultural blending, Norse words weaving into English, Viking art influencing Celtic designs, and new trade routes opening. Sometimes Viking leaders even became kings, ruling over mixed peoples and territories. The settlements often grew around strategic locations, river mouths, fertile valleys, or defensible hills. These places were hubs for trade, agriculture, and military power. You think about the bustling marketplaces, the mingling of languages and goods, and the uneasy peace between Vikings and locals. A quirky fact: Vikings also settled as far west as Newfoundland in modern-day Canada, around 500 years before Columbus. The site at L'Anse aux Meadows shows clear evidence of Norse presence, with turf houses and iron nails found amid dense forests. It's a testament to their adventurous spirit. The Viking colonization was not always peaceful. Conflicts with indigenous peoples, competition for land, and clashes with rival Viking clans shaped much of the settlement story. Yet over time, coexistence and cultural exchange often emerged. Remember those intricate runes and sagas? Settlements became centers where these stories were told and preserved. Farms weren't just places of work. They were cultural hearths where identity was forged anew. You also realize how adaptable the Vikings were. They brought technologies from home, but learned new techniques from locals, blending old and new to survive in diverse environments. Their ships allowed communication between distant settlements, keeping networks alive across the seas. In some cases, Viking settlements laid the foundation for future nations. Norway, Iceland, and parts of Scotland owe much of their early development to these Norse pioneers. Their legacy is embedded in place names, traditions, and even genetic makeup. So, stepping onto this new soil, the Vikings weren't just invaders, they were builders, settlers, and innovators. They transformed unknown landscapes into homes, weaving their culture into the fabric of Europe and beyond, creating chapters of history that still echo today. You stand at the prow of a Viking longship, eyes squinting against the spray of salt water and the chill of the morning breeze. Ahead stretches the open sea, a vast, uncertain expanse that your ancestors once faced with a mix of dread and exhilaration. The Vikings weren't content with local raids or nearby settlements. They were masters of the ocean, navigating with skill that baffled later explorers for centuries. Their navigation methods blended keen observation with a few ingenious tools. You might think that without modern instruments they'd be lost in fog or storms, but they weren't. Vikings used landmarks, the position of the sun and stars, the color of the water, and even the behavior of seabirds to keep their course. That sunstone crystal, which filters polarized light, may have helped them spot the sun on cloudy days, a natural compass of sorts, long before magnetic compasses were invented. Historians still argue whether these navigation techniques were widespread or limited to a few expert seafarers. Some suggest it was the secret knowledge of elite navigators passed down orally, while others believe most Vikings had at least basic sea skills. Either way, their success in traversing vast distances speaks to remarkable seafaring prowess. You imagine the longships slicing through waves, their shallow hulls allowing passage into rivers and estuaries unreachable by other vessels. These ships were light, fast, and sturdy, built to withstand the harshest North Atlantic storms. Their flexibility meant Vikings could explore as far west as Greenland and Newfoundland, south to the Mediterranean, and east along Russian rivers. A quirky detail: Vikings also used the flight patterns of whales and other marine animals as clues to nearby land, a natural GPS in action. Observing nature was critical for survival in a world with no maps or GPS signals. Their voyages weren't just about conquest. Many expeditions were trading missions or exploratory journeys. The famous Viking Eric the Red, for example, led settlers to Greenland, while Leif Erikson sailed even further west, reaching North America centuries before Columbus. These journeys weren't reckless gambles. They were carefully planned with knowledge accumulated over generations. You also realize that Viking ships were marvels of engineering. Built from overlapping planks called clinker construction, the hulls were flexible and strong. The square sail caught the wind for speed, while oars provided control and power in calm conditions. Vikings could cover impressive distances quickly, sometimes over 100 miles a day. Imagine the atmosphere aboard during long voyages: the creak of wood, the rhythmic splash of oars, the smell of salt and tar, and the hum of whispered prayers to gods for safe passage. The journey was perilous, but the promise of new lands and riches drove them onward. Their mastery of the seas gave Vikings a strategic advantage unmatched by many contemporaries. Their ability to appear suddenly anywhere along Europe's coasts or deep within river systems made them unpredictable and terrifying. No fortress was truly safe, no village completely secure. Historians still debate how Vikings communicated across vast distances. Some speculate they used signals like smoke or fire beacons, while others suggest networks of friendly settlements relayed messages quickly. Regardless, this maritime connectivity was a backbone for their raids, trade, and colonization. The legacy of Viking navigation is profound. Their techniques influenced later explorers, and their voyages reshaped maps and cultural horizons. Without them, the European understanding of the North Atlantic and beyond would have been far narrower. So, as you gaze into the horizon, remember that Viking sailors were not just warriors, but intrepid explorers and brilliant mariners whose love for the sea led them into history's pages as both nightmares and legends. You walk cautiously along the battered shoreline, the remains of a burned village smoldering behind you, as whispers of fear ripple through the nearby towns. The impact of Viking raids on Europe was more than just physical destruction. It was a shockwave that unsettled kingdoms, altered trade routes, and forced societies to rethink their defenses. These sudden attacks exposed vulnerabilities that medieval Europe had long ignored. When the Vikings struck, entire communities faced annihilation or displacement. Coastal towns scrambled to build fortifications, and rulers began levying new taxes to fund defenses. You can almost hear the clanging of blacksmiths forging weapons and the nervous chatter of villagers as watchmen scanned the horizon for dragon-shaped sails. Europe wasn't just fighting battles. It was facing a crisis of security and identity. Historians still argue the extent to which Viking raids accelerated political centralization. Some say the chaos pushed local lords to consolidate power and establish more organized armies. Others believe that economic disruptions forced changes in trade patterns, leading to the rise of new commercial centers and a shift in economic power. You picture the shock after the 793 AD raid on Lindisfarne, a wealthy monastery off the coast of England. The attack on this holy site sent tremors across Christendom, challenging notions of divine protection and exposing Europe's vulnerabilities. Monks fled with relics and treasures, and the raid became a symbol of Viking terror. Beyond the immediate fear, Viking raids had lasting effects on trade. Some routes were cut off, while others adapted. Vikings themselves became merchants, facilitating exchanges between East and West, moving silver, furs, spices, and slaves. Their presence reshaped economic landscapes, sometimes forcing Europe toward more maritime-focused commerce. A quirky note: in some areas, Vikings introduced new agricultural techniques and animal breeds, indirectly contributing to economic growth after initial destruction. It's a reminder that their impact wasn't purely negative. You imagine the psychological toll on populations living under constant threat. Stories of Viking brutality were spread widely, sometimes exaggerated to stoke fear, but enough to prompt mass migrations and changes in settlement patterns. Coastal defenses like burhs, fortified towns, sprang up across England as a direct response. The Vikings also influenced military tactics in Europe. Their hit-and-run style forced defenders to rethink traditional fortress designs and patrol strategies. The very idea of defense evolved because of these agile raiders. Remember that adaptability from earlier? Vikings themselves shifted tactics over time, from pure raiding to settling and ruling, integrating into the very societies they once terrorized. This fluidity changed the face of medieval Europe. Even the arts and culture weren't immune. The mixing of Viking and local styles gave rise to new forms of metalwork, shipbuilding, and storytelling. Their legacy is visible not only in historical records, but in the very fabric of European culture. So, as you stand amid the ashes and rebuilding towns, know that Viking raids were catalysts of change, terrifying, yes, but also transformative. Europe's nightmare forced it to evolve, laying groundwork for the medieval world that followed. You settle by the fire, watching the flickering shadows dance on the walls of a longhouse as the women of the Viking clan bustle about, mending clothes, preparing food, and weaving tales as potent as any sword. Viking women weren't just background figures. They were powerhouses, shaping the fate of their people from behind the scenes, and sometimes right on the battlefield. Their roles challenged the simplistic image of Vikings as only fierce warriors. Women managed farms and households, especially when men were away raiding or exploring. They controlled wealth, handled legal matters, and could even inherit property, a remarkable degree of agency for the time. You imagine a Viking woman holding court in her husband's absence, making decisions that could mean survival or ruin. Historians still debate how much actual power Viking women wielded. While sagas often praise strong women, some argue these stories reflect idealized roles rather than everyday reality. Nevertheless, archaeological finds show women buried with weapons and status items, suggesting some took on roles that blurred gender lines. One fascinating tidbit: the legendary shield maidens, female warriors who fought alongside men, may have been more than myth. Recent digs uncovered graves of women buried with full battle gear, indicating that at least some Viking women took up arms. So, maybe those stories of women charging into battle weren't just bedtime tales. Beyond the battlefield, women were custodians of culture and religion. They maintained oral traditions, recited sagas, and performed rituals that connected the community with the gods. Their role as keepers of memory helped preserve Viking identity across generations. You also realize Viking women were skilled traders and negotiators. Marriages often cemented alliances, and women sometimes acted as envoys or intermediaries. Their influence extended beyond the household to the political sphere. Quirky and practical, women crafted textiles, a highly valued skill, producing intricate fabrics dyed with natural colors. These garments weren't just for warmth. They signaled status and clan identity. A woman's weaving could speak louder than any sword. Their legal rights included the ability to divorce, an uncommon provision in many contemporary societies. This legal independence gave Viking women a voice and choice that's often overlooked. Remember those long ships and settlements? Women accompanied expeditions, helping establish new colonies and communities. Their work laid the foundation for Viking society's stability, balancing the chaos of raids with continuity at home. So, as you lean into the warmth, know that Viking women were more than bystanders. They were leaders, warriors, and pillars of their world, quiet but formidable forces who shaped the saga as much as the men with axes. You find yourself amid a bustling Viking marketplace, the air thick with the mingled scents of salted fish, fresh herbs, and smoke from open fires. Merchants shout, bargaining fiercely over goods ranging from furs and amber to weapons and slaves. This is the economic heartbeat of Viking society, a world fueled by a mix of trade and plunder that brought both wealth and influence across continents. Vikings weren't just raiders who took what they wanted. They were savvy traders who established networks stretching from the markets of Byzantium to the rivers of Russia. Their long ships carried not only swords and shields, but also silver coins, textiles, and exotic goods, fueling a vibrant economy. You picture a trader weighing a sack of silver, calculating the value of his latest haul, balancing risk and reward with practiced eyes. Historians still argue how much of the Viking economy relied on plunder versus trade. Some scholars suggest that as raids became riskier, trade took on a larger role, with Vikings becoming middlemen connecting distant cultures. Others emphasize the enduring importance of raiding as a means of acquiring wealth and status. Likely it was a fluid balance, shifting with political and social changes. A quirky detail: Vikings minted their own coins in some regions, but often they used silver hacksilver, cut pieces of silver ingots or jewelry, traded by weight rather than minted currency. It's like carrying around a bunch of silver puzzle pieces and hoping the next merchant can make sense of them. Slave trade was also a significant part of the economy. Captives from raids were sold or kept as laborers. While this dark aspect of Viking life is less celebrated, it was integral to their wealth accumulation. Some slaves, called thralls, worked in households, farms, or crafts, and their lives were strictly controlled. Trade routes connected Viking settlements from the North Atlantic through Eastern Europe and down to the Mediterranean. Vikings exchanged goods like furs, walrus ivory, and amber for silks, spices, and precious metals, weaving a complex web of economic exchange. Their mercantile ventures often preceded or followed raiding expeditions, blurring the line between war and commerce. Imagine the marketplaces of Birka in Sweden or Hedeby in Denmark, hubs of activity where cultures clashed and mingled, languages mixed, goods from distant lands changed hands, and new ideas spread. These towns were more than just economic centers. They were cultural crossroads. The Vikings also developed specialized crafts to support trade. Skilled artisans produced intricate jewelry, weapons, and textiles that were highly prized. Their artistic styles influenced and were influenced by other cultures, creating a unique Norse aesthetic. Remember those legal assemblies, the things we touched on in settlement stories? These also regulated trade, resolving disputes and ensuring contracts were honored. Vikings had surprisingly advanced systems for commerce, balancing risk with trust in often chaotic environments. So, as you navigate the crowded market stalls, you see the Vikings not just as fierce raiders, but as clever entrepreneurs whose economy thrived on a dynamic mix of trade, plunder, and negotiation. Their wealth and influence flowed far beyond battlefields, reaching into the hearts of distant cities and shaping medieval commerce in ways still felt today. You crouch behind a crumbling stone wall, hearing the distant clang of metal and the anguished cries drifting from a monastery under siege. The air is thick with smoke and fear as the Vikings' longships darken the horizon, approaching Lindisfarne, one of the most sacred Christian sites in Europe. This 793 AD raid wasn't just a violent act. It was a shock that rippled through Christendom, shattering illusions of divine protection and signaling a new era of terror. The monks, devoted to prayer and contemplation, were utterly unprepared for the savage assault. You can almost see the Vikings storming the island, axes swinging, treasures plundered, relics stolen, and holy sanctuaries desecrated. It wasn't just a physical attack, it was a symbolic one, challenging the spiritual authority of the church. Historians still debate whether this raid was the true beginning of the Viking Age or simply the first recorded instance of many brutal raids to come. Regardless, Lindisfarne became the grim symbol of Viking ferocity and Europe's vulnerability. The attack shocked the medieval world, leading to increased fortifications and calls for unity against the Norse threat. The choice of a religious site as a target had strategic and psychological reasons. Monasteries were wealthy, poorly defended, and their destruction sent a powerful message. You can almost hear the panicked prayers mixed with screams, a grim soundtrack to history's dark turning point. A quirky fact: some scholars suggest the Vikings respected the sanctity of religious artifacts enough to plunder them carefully, treating relics as prized trophies rather than destroying them outright. This adds a complex layer to the raid's brutality. Vandalism mingled with reverence for power objects. The Lindisfarne raid spurred many coastal communities across Europe to build defensive structures and organize local militias. This arms race shaped the development of medieval fortifications and military organization. The fear of Vikings wasn't just about loss of life, but the existential threat to cultural and religious identity. The church itself used the raid to frame Vikings as agents of the devil, fueling propaganda that painted the Norse as heathen monsters. This narrative still influences popular images today, but the reality was more nuanced. Vikings were indeed brutal, but they also traded with and settled among Christians, sometimes even converting themselves. You imagine the Vikings themselves, fierce and pragmatic, viewing these raids as necessary acts of survival and glory, not religious crusades. Their own gods promised honor in battle, so striking at Christian monasteries was a way to gain wealth and status. Remember those long ships slicing through water from earlier? They were the tools of this terror, allowing sudden and devastating attacks that traditional armies couldn't predict or counter effectively. The shock factor was their greatest weapon. So, as you stand in the smoldering ruins of Lindisfarne, feel the weight of history's turning point, the moment when Viking raids truly shook Europe to its core, igniting centuries of conflict, adaptation, and transformation. You trudge through a mist-shrouded forest in the British Isles, the sounds of distant church bells mingling with the whispers of ancient oaks. The Vikings didn't just arrive as merciless invaders. Over decades, their relationship with England, Scotland, and Ireland became tangled, sometimes hostile, sometimes cooperative, and eventually deeply integrated. The story here is one of fear, conflict, and surprising fusion. In England, Viking raids evolved into more permanent presences. They established the Danelaw, territories under Norse law and culture, where Scandinavian customs mingled with Anglo-Saxon traditions. You imagine the daily life in these areas, Norse and English traders haggling side by side, intermarriages blurring cultural lines, and local laws adapting to accommodate both peoples. Historians still argue the degree to which Viking culture reshaped British identity. Some emphasize assimilation, showing how Norse customs enriched English language and law. Others point to persistent conflicts, rebellions, and cultural clashes that defined centuries. Probably both forces were at work, a push and pull between resistance and adaptation. In Ireland, Viking settlers founded major ports like Dublin and Waterford, transforming them into thriving trade centers. You can picture Norsemen trading furs and weapons for Irish silver and food, sometimes allying with local kings, and at other times, warring fiercely. These settlements became melting pots where Gaelic and Norse cultures blended. Scotland, with its rugged coasts and islands, was similarly shaped by Viking incursions and settlements. Norse influence remains visible in place names and archaeological sites, a testament to centuries of Norse presence and interaction with local clans. A quirky fact: many English words today, like sky, window, and knife, have Old Norse origins, a linguistic legacy of Viking settlement and integration. So, next time you look out your window, thank a Viking wordsmith. Viking rulers in these lands often walked a tightrope between being conquerors and assimilated monarchs. Figures like King Cnut in England ruled vast kingdoms while adopting Christian customs and governance. This political blending shows how Vikings transitioned from feared outsiders to legitimate rulers. You also recall those Viking women from the last section who likely played key roles in these communities, maintaining traditions and forging new identities amid cultural collisions. Remember the long ships that brought Vikings to these shores? Those vessels carried not just warriors, but families, traders, and settlers, agents of change as much as destruction. So, wandering through the mist and ruins of the British Isles, you see a saga of conflict and coexistence, where Vikings shifted from nightmares to neighbors, forever altering the history and culture of these lands. You settle in a wooden hall, the low murmur of voices discussing disputes and laws filling the air as Viking elders gather around a roaring fire. The Viking world wasn't just chaos and battle. It had its own surprising order, rooted in a system of laws and customs that kept society from tearing itself apart. This legal framework was vital to maintaining peace in often volatile and competitive communities. Vikings held things, public assemblies where free men met to discuss laws, settle disputes, and make decisions. Picture a gathering on a hilltop or by a river where chieftains, warriors, and farmers voiced their opinions, witnessed oaths, and judged cases. These things were both legislative and judicial bodies, early forms of democracy mixed with tradition. Historians still debate the extent to which Viking law influenced modern European legal systems. Some argue that aspects of Norse legal practices, such as trial by oath and communal decision-making, filtered into later medieval law. Others see them as unique adaptations to a specific cultural context, fading as centralized monarchies rose. A quirky detail, in some Viking communities, disputes were settled through vergild, a system of compensation paid to victims or their families instead of revenge killings. This pragmatic approach aimed to reduce blood feuds and restore balance, a medieval version of "let's settle this without all the stabbing." The laws covered a broad range of issues: property rights, inheritance, marriage, and even fishing rights. You imagine the tension as two neighbors argue over a boundary, only to have the community step in with a fair judgment. These customs ensured everyone knew their rights and responsibilities, essential in a world where brute force could otherwise dominate. Women had legal rights too, including the right to divorce and own property, a notable feature for the era. This legal empowerment helped balance the societal roles discussed earlier and gave Viking women significant influence. Remember the holmgang duel from Section 4? This was part of the legal culture, a controlled way to resolve conflicts and uphold honor. Though dangerous, it prevented endless cycles of revenge by settling disputes conclusively. Viking laws were often oral, but some were written down later, like the Icelandic Gragas, preserving these traditions for posterity. These records provide fascinating insights into how Vikings balanced freedom with responsibility. You can picture the harsh penalties for crimes like theft or murder, but also the emphasis on fairness and restitution. Law wasn't just about punishment. It was about maintaining the fragile peace in a world where communities depended on cooperation. So, as voices rise and fall in that hall, you realize the Vikings were more than warriors. They were lawmakers, crafting social contracts that allowed their fierce culture to endure and adapt. Their legal legacy, though often overshadowed by tales of battle, reveals a people deeply committed to order within chaos. You lean into the shadows of a smoky hall, the flicker of firelight revealing fierce faces and war-painted cheeks. But beneath the surface lies a question that historians still wrestle with. Just how violent were the Vikings really? The image of berserkers rampaging with axes and fury is vivid, but separating fact from fiction is trickier than you might think. Popular culture paints Vikings as relentless savages, tearing through villages with no mercy, but the reality was often more complex. Yes, they were brutal warriors, but they were also skilled negotiators, traders, and settlers who knew the value of diplomacy and alliances. Violence was a tool, not an end in itself. Historians still argue whether Viking violence was uniquely savage or exaggerated by the victims' accounts and later medieval chroniclers. Many of the surviving stories come from Christian monks who had every reason to demonize the Norse invaders. So, while Vikings were certainly fearsome, some say their reputation has been inflated over centuries. You picture the chaos of a raid, shields clashing, axes swinging, but also the calculated strikes and retreats that defined Viking warfare. Their strategy wasn't pure chaos. It was precision, speed, and sometimes even restraint to avoid prolonged conflicts that could drain resources. A quirky fact: Viking warriors sometimes took prisoners for ransom rather than killing everyone outright. This pragmatic approach to raiding shows they valued profit and survival as much as bloodlust. Beyond the battlefield, Viking society had strict codes of conduct that limited violence among their own people. Internal disputes were often resolved through law and negotiation, not endless fighting. Excessive cruelty could bring dishonor, undermining a warrior's standing. You also consider the archaeological evidence of mass graves and weapons found in battle sites. These reveal the brutal reality of conflict, but also the presence of organized warfare with rules and strategies. Remember the warrior code and legal systems from earlier sections? Those cultural elements worked to balance the destructive potential of violence, making Viking society a place where strength was tempered by honor and law. So, while Vikings earned their fearsome reputation through real acts of violence, the myth of non-stop, indiscriminate savagery is just that, a myth. The truth lies somewhere in between, fierce fighters who were as strategic and socially complex as any warriors of their time. As you settle into that smoky hall, the flickering firelight reminds you that history is often more layered than legend, and the Viking story is no exception. A blend of brutality, cunning, and surprisingly human complexity. You find yourself in a bustling Viking marketplace, where the sharp calls of merchants mingle with the clatter of goods being exchanged. Among the traded items, you notice a grim commodity, thralls or slaves, bought and sold as part of the Viking economy and social system. The role of slavery in Viking society is a shadowy but significant chapter, one that deepens the understanding of what made Vikings both feared and effective. Slavery wasn't unique to Vikings, of course, but their use and trade of thralls were integral to their wealth and power. Captured during raids or inherited, thralls performed hard labor on farms, in households, and workshops. You imagine the stark contrast between free warriors and enslaved workers, one group wielding axes, the other wielding tools under watchful eyes. Historians still debate the exact scale and conditions of Viking slavery. Some evidence suggests thralls had limited rights and could sometimes buy their freedom, while other sources imply harsh treatment and lifelong bondage. The complexity reflects the varied nature of Viking society across regions and time. A quirky detail: some sagas hint at thralls being more than mere property. They could marry, have families, and occasionally rise to notable status. Though rare, these stories suggest a nuanced social fabric rather than a rigid slave-master divide. Slaves were also commodities in Viking trade networks. Thralls captured in Britain or Eastern Europe were sold in markets stretching from Scandinavia to Byzantium. This trade connected Vikings to larger economic systems, fueling their ventures far beyond simple raiding. The practice of slavery influenced Viking raids themselves. Sometimes the goal wasn't just gold or goods, but capturing people who could be sold or used to boost a household's labor force. This pragmatic approach reinforced the brutal efficiency of Viking raids. You also recall that Viking settlements relied heavily on thrall labor to build farms, clear land, and sustain communities, underscoring how slavery was woven into the social and economic fabric. Remember the legal codes from earlier? Some protected thralls from the worst abuses, setting fines for their mistreatment. This reflects a society where even slavery had some regulated boundaries. Slavery's legacy is uncomfortable but essential to understanding Viking power and influence. It was part of their economic engine, fueling expansion and wealth accumulation, even as it reflects the darker sides of their culture. So, as you walk through that marketplace, the echoes of thralls' voices remind you that Viking society was complex, combining fierce independence with harsh social hierarchies, where freedom and bondage existed side by side in a world constantly in motion. You stand on the windswept shores of a Viking settlement, the sun dipping low as shadows stretch over fields that have seen generations pass. But the Viking Age, like all great eras, was drawing to a close. The causes and effects of this decline are as complex as the people themselves, woven from shifts in politics, culture, and the very tides of history. By the late 11th century, Europe was changing. Kingdoms grew stronger and more centralized, able to resist and repel raids that once sent villages into panic. Fortifications became more sophisticated, and standing armies replaced the militia-style defenses that Vikings once exploited. The shock and awe tactics were losing their edge. Historians still debate whether the Viking decline was due mainly to European resistance or internal changes in Norse society. Some argue that the Vikings' own adoption of Christianity and integration into European culture diminished the warrior spirit that drove raids. Others see economic shifts, like the rise of trade networks reducing the lure of raiding, as central factors. One fascinating tidbit: the Christianization of Scandinavia wasn't just religious. It brought new political alliances, literacy, and legal systems, transforming Viking culture profoundly. Churches replaced pagan temples, and the old warrior ethos gave way to more settled, agrarian lifestyles. Vikings also faced pressures from new external forces, emerging powers in Eastern Europe, shifts in trade routes, and climate changes that made some lands less hospitable. These combined stresses eroded the old ways. You can picture former raiders turning to farming, trading, or serving as mercenaries. The age of longships gave way to knights and castles, signaling a new medieval world order. But the Viking legacy didn't vanish. It morphed, blending into the fabric of European nations. Remember the settlements and parliaments we spoke of earlier? These institutions matured, laying foundations for modern governance in places like Iceland and Norway, showing continuity amid change. The Viking Age's end wasn't a sudden collapse, but a gradual transformation, an evolution shaped by both internal choices and external pressures. Their world didn't disappear. It became part of something larger and more complex. So, as twilight falls over those northern shores, the echoes of battle cries soften into the quiet rhythms of daily life. The nightmare fades, but the story, resilient and enduring, carries on in the cultures and histories of Europe and beyond. You paddle silently down a wide, misty river, the dense forest pressing close to the banks as you navigate deeper into lands unfamiliar and wild. The Vikings weren't just a northern scourge of Western Europe. They journeyed far eastward too, traveling along rivers that carved through vast forests and stepping stones of emerging cities. Their influence shaped not only the Atlantic shores, but also the heartlands of what would become Russia and Eastern Europe. These Norse adventurers, often called Varangians in Eastern accounts, used their longships to explore and trade along waterways like the Dnieper and Volga rivers. You imagine their boats slipping past dense woods, stopping at trading posts where furs, honey, and slaves exchanged hands for silver and luxury goods from Byzantium and the Islamic world. Historians still debate how much the Vikings influenced the formation of early Russian states. Some argue that Norse leaders helped found the Kievan Rus, a federation of Slavic tribes, bringing military skills, governance models, and trade connections that laid the groundwork for future kingdoms. Others emphasize Slavic roots, seeing Vikings as catalysts rather than creators. A quirky tidbit: the elite Varangian Guard served as the personal bodyguards of Byzantine emperors, famous for their loyalty and ferocity. It's a striking image: Norse warriors from frozen lands protecting imperial palaces in sunny Constantinople. The eastern voyages weren't just military, they were economic lifelines. Vikings controlled vital trade routes linking Scandinavia to the Black Sea and Caspian regions, facilitating the flow of goods and culture between distant peoples. This network extended their reach far beyond Europe's western edges. You can picture Viking settlers mingling with local Slavic and Finno-Ugric peoples, exchanging customs, languages, and technologies. Artifacts from this era reveal a fascinating blend of Norse and Eastern influences in weaponry, jewelry, and everyday items. Remember those sunstones and runes? They likely guided these far-flung journeys, while tales of Eastern riches fueled dreams of exploration and conquest. The Vikings' presence in Eastern Europe was a mix of trader, warrior, and ruler, shaping the political and cultural landscape of the region in ways still visible today. From river forts to sprawling cities, their footprint endured. So, as you drift down that misty river, remember the Vikings as more than coastal raiders. They were explorers and empire builders whose reach extended deep into the heart of Eurasia, connecting worlds and shaping histories. You stroll through a modern European city, cobblestones worn smooth underfoot, names of streets whispering tales of old Norse legends. The Viking legacy is all around you, not just in museums or sagas, but woven into the very DNA of the continent. Their impact resonates in language, culture, genetics, and the myths that shape European identity even today. From the rugged fjords of Norway to the rolling hills of England, Viking blood flows in countless veins. Genetic studies reveal Scandinavian ancestry in populations across the British Isles and beyond, a living testament to centuries-old migrations, marriages, and settlements. It's fascinating to realize that a Viking warrior's legacy might be part of your own story. Historians still discuss how deeply Viking culture influenced Europe's development. Some see Norse contributions as foundational, shaping trade networks, legal systems, and art, while others argue that Vikings adapted more than they transformed. The truth is a rich tapestry of interaction, conflict, and blending. Language offers vivid clues. English is peppered with Old Norse words like window, knife, and husband, subtly reminding us of a Norse presence that once redefined the British Isles. Place names like York, from Jorvik, and Dublin, Dublin, trace back to Viking roots, landmarks of their enduring imprint. A quirky tidbit: Viking-style jewelry and art enjoy a renaissance in modern fashion, with motifs like Thor's hammer and intricate knotwork adorning everything from pendants to tattoos. This blend of ancient and modern keeps their culture alive in fresh, unexpected ways. Viking myths continue to captivate. Stories of Odin's wisdom, Thor's thunderous strength, and Loki's mischief inspire books, movies, and games worldwide. These tales, passed down through generations, offer not just entertainment, but a glimpse into Norse values and worldview. Their maritime innovations, like shipbuilding techniques, influenced naval architecture for centuries. Even modern Scandinavian societies pride themselves on the Viking spirit of exploration, resilience, and adaptability. You also see how Viking legal traditions and communal assemblies echo in modern democratic practices, especially in places like Iceland, where the Althing remains one of the oldest parliaments in the world. Remember those settlers and traders from earlier sections? Their integration into local cultures laid foundations for nations and identities that endure, blending Viking legacy with indigenous traditions. So, as you wander these streets, feel the pulse of history beneath your feet. the Viking nightmare has transformed into a cultural heritage that continues to inspire, shape, and enrich modern Europe in countless ways. You step cautiously into an archaeological dig site, where shards of pottery and fragments of iron tools tell stories far older than any book. New discoveries continually challenge and reshape our understanding of the Vikings, not the one-dimensional brutes of legend, but complex people with rich cultures and surprising nuances. Recent digs have uncovered Viking settlements far beyond traditional boundaries, from North America to the Middle East, revealing a scope of exploration and interaction that defies earlier stereotypes. You picture archaeologists brushing away layers of earth, unearthing artifacts that speak of trade, craftsmanship, and everyday life. Historians still debate how much these discoveries alter the established narrative. Some argue they reveal Vikings as global traders and settlers rather than mere raiders. Others caution against rewriting history too quickly, emphasizing that violence and raiding remained central to Viking culture. A quirky detail: excavations in Greenland found evidence of Norse farming practices adapting to changing climates, including the surprising cultivation of barley, an impressive feat given the harsh environment. This adaptability highlights Viking resilience beyond warfare. Technological advances like DNA analysis and underwater archaeology have unveiled Viking shipwrecks and burial sites, providing insights into their social hierarchies, diets, and even health. These findings paint a fuller picture of Viking life, sometimes at odds with the brutal caricature. You might be surprised to learn that Viking art was incredibly sophisticated, featuring intricate animal motifs and symbolic designs that influenced European art for centuries. Their craftsmanship extended from jewelry to runestones, marking territory and commemorating heroes. Remember the myths and sagas? Some of these recent finds give credence to stories once dismissed as mere legend, blurring the lines between fact and folklore. These new perspectives force us to rethink the Viking label itself, not just as fearsome warriors, but as multifaceted people who shaped medieval history in unexpected ways. So, as you sift through these layers of time, know that the Viking story is still unfolding, enriched by fresh discoveries that deepen our respect and fascination for this ancient culture. You sit quietly on a hill overlooking a vast, misty coastline, where the sun slowly slips beneath the horizon, casting a golden glow over the restless sea. Here, in this moment, you reflect on what truly made the Vikings Europe's nightmare, a storm of fear and fascination that swept through centuries, leaving an indelible mark on history. It wasn't just their ferocity in battle, nor the thunder of their longships cutting through waves. It was the perfect storm of factors: their unmatched maritime skills, a culture steeped in warrior honor and spiritual fervor, their adaptability as traders and settlers, and the psychological terror their sudden raids inflicted. They were unpredictable, able to strike one day and vanish the next, leaving shattered communities and questions that lingered for generations. Historians still debate the balance between myth and reality in the Viking legacy. Were they brutal savages or pragmatic survivors? Raiders or empire builders? The answer is complex. They were all these things and more, a people shaped by their harsh environment and driven by a restless spirit that sought glory, wealth, and belonging. Their gods promised honor in battle. Their ships carried them across vast oceans. Their laws held their communities together. The blend of brutality and culture created a force that Western Europe wasn't prepared to face. Quirky yet telling, the very word Viking might come from Vik, meaning bay or creek, places where these warriors launched their attacks, slipping silently from shadows. Their identity was tied to the sea, to movement and change, never static or predictable. You remember the women who managed homesteads and sometimes took up arms, the legal assemblies that governed disputes, the traders who wove connections across continents, and the settlers who laid down roots in new lands. Vikings were not monsters but people, complex and resilient, who carved a legacy both feared and admired. So as twilight deepens, the nightmare softens into legend, a story of courage, change, and enduring influence. The Vikings shaped Europe not just through fear, but through transformation, reminding us that history's fiercest storms often give way to new horizons.